Okay, let's go into some high-level guidance on how. So I'm not going to sort of go into the detail of like, you know, getting the, you know, downloading the documents and all of this. I'm just going to give you, a little bit higher level how you organize around doing lots of applications. The first thing is assess and record the work required for the bid and by when. And by this, you don't need a lot of work. But off the top of your head, you can probably tell that if it's a European government or an African Union bid, it's probably going to be quite long, or a National Science Foundation bid, it's going to be quite long. If it's for an innovation fund, in theory, it should be quite straightforward and short. That's not always the case. If it's for a small amount of money, it should be relatively short form. If it's for a large amount of money, it should be quite long, So obviously you want to find out pretty quickly by getting the instructions or the application form, if there is one, what kind of work is required for the bid. A really good thing to do here, and something I do a lot of, is I look at the people who have previously received that money and ask them to share their bid with me. Like I just try and find out those people and ask, or even just ask, was this a 15-page document or a 70-page document or a 2-page document? Rather than sharing the bid, like give me a sense of how much work's involved. And then by when. And when I say record the work required by when, literally put it in your calendar. Put it in your diary. Block out time in your diary. If the budget looks big and complicated, block it out in your diary. And we'll come on to other steps, but you really should begin by assessing the amount of work involved, because it can get very stressful if you're trying to do everything towards the end and you realize it's not worth it. Keep a separate fundraising folder. This is my approach. You might have your own, but I like to have a folder called fundraising. And then if the funding bid gets funded, have another folder, a separate folder for the implementation, for the actual project. But you've always got the original bid to refer back to when you're doing implementation. So try and keep them separate somehow. And you might want to use the original bid, take a copy of it and put it in the implementation folder. And then you can start scribbling on it and making notes and ideas and whatever if you need to. But yeah, have your own fundraising folder. And this is what ours looks like at the Internet of Production. And it's basically one funding opportunity, one folder. So in our documents folder, we have a subfolder called fundraising. We also have things like communications and the Make project and events and things like that. But we have one called fundraising. And then inside that folder, we have the different bids that we've applied to. And you can see the one that's highlighted there is the RISA 2024 bid. Now, we also have a RISA 2024 project folder, which is where we put the implementation, the reporting, the contracting, all the things that, the slides for this webinar are in that folder, but it's separate from the fundraising folder. So at the Internet of Production, we've got quite a small fundraising folder. This video is from my previous organization, Field Ready. So this is the top level. And we have a folder for grants. We have a folder for in-kind contributions because we got a lot of free software, such as from Google. We have the resource mobilization tool, which I talked about last time, and we have some toolkits and things. But if you go into the grants folder, we have some subfolders. We have funding bids that were in progress at the time when I left the organization. We have funding bids that we'd started but decided to put on hold, funding bids that we'd postponed, ones where we'd been shortlisted, ones that we'd submitted but not been successful with yet. And then at the top, funding bids that we abandoned, funding bids that were successful, That was reasonably long. I quite like this folder. I'm really proud of some of the work in that folder, even now, 10 years later. And we also have a folder called unsuccessful. This is a sad folder. I'm very, very sad about this folder. But we came up with a naming system. So we labeled it unsuccessful Syria medical kits, or unsuccessful Uganda COVID-19. So what you might see as you watch through that video is that we would sort of label things almost by department, because Field Ready was an international organization. So some was for the Syria office, some was from the Nepal office, some was from the Uganda office, whatever it might be. So there was, but we kept everything in the same place. That also allows you to search it and allows you to be able to find stuff that you've written before more easily. So keeping an organized fundraising folder, and you'll thank yourself when on the day of submission, when you organize all of your work, because when you come back to it, you want it to be nice and tidy. And if you need to access it in a hurry, such as in the middle of a meeting with a donor about your application, you can find it more easily. How to write a funding bid? Ask for help, including right now from us. Please, you know, I'm glad Fab Lab Winam has started working with one of our fundraisers, Dan Butler. But I think we now have 7 fundraisers on contract, and they're doing lots of things, but they can also do things for you. So do get in touch, do reach out if you need some help. The list I'm going to show you now is areas that I almost always ask for help with. I don't really need help with the narrative very often, although if I don't have time, I will ask a fundraiser to write it for me. But I don't really need much help with the narrative very often. These are the areas where I do need help. References. I hate doing references. So what I tend to do is I put a comment in saying, please link to this web page. And then I will ask someone who actually knows how to do proper referencing, usually someone like my colleague Sarah, who's got an academic background and works in the university, to help me turn that into a proper, well-written reference. I don't like doing work plans. I quite like doing work plans, but you know, the spreadsheets where you have the Gantt chart of, you know, what activity is going to happen when. If I sometimes do this myself if it's simple, but there are other people who love doing that kind of work, particularly project manager types. So our colleague Benita is really good at this kind of thing because she can understand how all the flows go. The other thing is, when I do a work plan, I tend to be really optimistic at how long things take. And you probably want to ask someone who's more realistic about how long things take to do your work plan for you. So ask somebody else for help with that. I'm not going to talk about logical framework too much, but a logical framework or a log frame is a tool that some donors ask for. I hate them. And I actually have, I get angry almost that these things are required by some donors, particularly government donors. And because of that, I automatically find someone who loves doing them and ask for their help to do it for me. So if you need a logical framework done, there are fundraisers in our group that can help you. Same thing for theory of change, which is another fundraising term. There's plenty of open information on the internet about what a theory of change or what a logical framework is. I'm not going to teach you that in these sessions. But yeah, reaching out to someone who can help, who enjoys doing theory of change. And the theory of change might be as simple as, we train makerspaces in how to do high quality fundraising bids. Those makerspace managers can then write higher quality funding bids and therefore earn more money and be more financially sustainable, therefore supporting the research and innovation systems of Africa. That's the theory of change. It's a very simple one about training and capacity building. You teach somebody something, they use what you teach them, things change. The monitoring, evaluation, and learning plan. There are people who have entire careers writing and implementing these. Depends on the donor, but sometimes this calls for specialist work. Creating an indicator can be a bit of an art. Counting the number of people who are attending on this call is actually an indicator in our project. But if we had said in our design for this project how many people had gone to write a funding bid because of the call today, we'd have no way to track that. I mean, we might ask you on WhatsApp occasionally, but also you might not use this knowledge for another year's time. That's after the project finishes in December. So there's no way for us to track it. So you need a monitoring, someone who can think about these things, has a bit of experience, and you actually, it doesn't need to be someone who has experience. In fact, the monitoring, evaluation, learning plan for this project was created by Anna Lowe, and it was her first ever monitoring, evaluation, learning plan. She's never had to write one before. But it's a logical thing. And the point about it is you need to just spend time thinking about it. And, you know, if you're busy trying to get the rest of the submission done and make sure that the narrative is well argued and there's other things still to be filled in, the monitoring, evaluation, learning plan, or the MEL plan, can be a difficult thing to write. So just having someone who's a little bit stepped back from doing the bid, who can help do that for you. And you need to have a meeting every so often to make sure it all lines up. But that's quite good, you know, reaching out for help for that. Reach out for help with the data management plan, and we'll, from last year's project, we'll have some examples from the different makerspaces. But we'll also, you know, make available a data management plan that perhaps is relevant to you as part of the materials we share from this course. Same with the gender equities or social inclusion policy, or whatever the donor might call it, but an inclusion policy, and, you know, other organizational policies, a little bit like the data management plan. Those are things which can be parceled up, and you can reach out to somebody else to prepare that bit of the funding bid for you. And you can simply say, look, we're going to be teaching makerspaces about fundraising. Our policy here calls for us to make sure that some of the attendees are women. Part of the policy will be that we make it inclusive, so we're going to record it so that people can access it later at their own pace, and we're going to do it online so we can increase participation at lower cost, things like that. So you can have a quick conversation with whoever's writing the policy for you to look at the activities you're writing in the bid, and just say, you know, please deal with this rather separate part of the bid that's more, you know, it speaks to the whole bid, not any particular one question. And then you can parcel it up and ask someone else for help. So I will often reach out for help on those. Another way to help yourself, and another trick in how you write a funding bid, after you've done a number of bids, you can create a master bid document. And a master bid document is like a collection. It's a simple document, which is just a collection of commonly asked questions. So, you know, describe your organization introduce your, you know, if you're in Kisumu, you know, say a little bit about the area of Kisumu in Kenya. And then you can copy and paste those answers from the master bid document, rather than going through lots and lots and lots of different funding bids. And the same with some of those policies or some of those work plans, or even the budget, in fact, you know, things you need to remember to include in the budget. A master bid document can can be really helpful. And if you then bring other people into your team, or if you have handovers of staff, or you bring in a consultant to write a particular bid, one of our consultants perhaps, who you might want to come and help you as part of this package, they can use your master bid document, because everything they need to know about you is in that document. A little bit about my technique now, about how I like to write a bid. And literally, this is my behavior. Okay, and this is how I create the space to be able to do funding bids all the time. So here's some of my approaches, my personal techniques. And honestly, do what works for you, but this is what works for me. Make notes first. Don't try to answer the question well. Just put ideas. If there's a question at the top, put ideas of how you want to answer that question. Fill out the specifics later. Just put some ideas in and build those ideas up over time. Part of the way I like to do this is through conversations with people. So if the funding bid is for, let's say, a training, or let's say it's going to be a training course on manufacturing the open flexion microscope. The open flexion microscope is a 3D printed microscope that's quite popular. It's open hardware, whatever. Great, good product, have lots of purposes, blah, blah, blah. Here's the question from the donor. Now I've got to, this is what I want to do. How could I fit it into this? I talk to the open flexion microscope people. I give them a ring. And literally, as we're talking, I write ideas into the form, because I find it easier to have a conversation than to have ideas with other people than to do everything in my own head. So I quite like the discussion. And sometimes, and Becca, and who's on the call today, will see me do this. when I do this, sometimes I go and walk around. I go into the car park outside our building and I walk around, and it helps me to think and to speak. And then when something good comes up, I'll go and make a note of it on my phone and type it in. Invest in the space to write, the time and space to write. So by the space to write, I mean, if you can't work in the makerspace because there's too much going on, find somewhere else. Travel to a library, or travel, so that when you get there, you've got one thing to do, which is to write the funding bid. Get someone else to review it. I love doing this, and often I will ask my wife, and this is quite helpful, particularly if you think your answers are too waffly or sound a little bit like bullshit. But yeah, get someone else to review it. And then I have to admit, I'm sorry, I've got some somewhat naughty tips and tricks. I'm not recommending these. Not recommending these. But they are kind of useful tips and tricks, okay? If a donor asks, and Risa did this to me, I don't mind saying, a funding bid that's funding this project. If they ask what the problem is, and then or the problems you want to address, and you go da 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 da, and then on the next page they say, and how are you going to solve these problems? It drives me nuts. I literally just said some of this in the previous bit, because it's quite hard to talk about the problem without a solution. So in the case of the Risa bid, and partly because I know the fund managers, I know the donors, and it was a Word document form, I actually just wrote in the document to make, because there were so many activities, I've answered this question in the question above. I'm not recommending it. but occasionally it's useful. Yeah. Yeah, exactly, Steve. I'm not recommending these, but like, if you can get away with it, sometimes the donors need help. Like they've spent a long time thinking about their application forms, and sometimes they're a big mess. You know, so yeah, see above. Now this is a very naughty trick. Oh my God, I can't believe I'm admitting this to you. Every now and again, if the donor has an online form, and or even they want you're supposed to email in your bid, and there's some simple document, and it has to be simple. Don't do this with the narrative. Don't do this with the budget. But some simple thing, like a letter of support or something that you're supposed to have, or a copy of a receipt for 3 quotes as evidence for the budget, and you haven't had time to do it. I literally will go on and make a blank PDF. I'll open a blank document, print a blank PDF, create a blank PDF and attach it, give it the file name as if it's the real thing, and I'll submit it. And if the donor's any good, they'll come back to you and say, there seems to be a problem with this PDF. Could you send it again? And what you've done is you've bought yourself a few hours. Don't do it with any significant document, but you can do it with insignificant documents that you don't have time to do properly. I'm really nervous about saying this one out loud, but yes, I have done this. And thanks, Steve. Yeah, if you miss it, you could link to a document, and you know, after you've submitted, then that's when you work on the link. Yeah, it's the same principle, same idea. Now, this is actually quite a nice one, and this isn't always naughty. This is not always naughty. You don't always have to be like, you know, feel bad when you do this. Budget in categories. Don't say things like flights, venues, trainers, you know, indirect costs. You know, those are line items. Those are specific things you're spending money on. You might want to budget in categories. So here's an example. For an Innovation Norway bid that I did, it's 7 million Norwegian kroner, which is about $700,000. It was an online form. It was about 7 minutes before the deadline on the online form. And I'd copied and pasted in all the text, and I was clicking next, next, next. And then suddenly, 7 minutes before the deadline, they asked for a budget. And I hadn't realized that one was needed 7 minutes before the deadline. So sometimes one of the reasons you budget in a category is because you don't have time, right? But actually, this can be quite a good way to budget. So literally what I did 7 minutes before the deadline is I wrote this. I entered it into the online form. Didn't get a spreadsheet. Didn't, you know, I got a calculator and I said, what's the total? And you might be able to tell something here. What's the total? 7.2 million Norwegian kroner. All right, well, I'm going to spend 10% here. I'm going to spend 20% here. And I just did percentages. Literally, I created a bunch of categories: beneficiary consultations, machine deployment and training, field testing in Turkey. I created categories and just put percentages in. I took a percentage of the total and put it in. And I submitted it 3 minutes before the deadline. I've never put a budget for $700,000 together so quickly in my life. The adrenaline was pumping, but I got it done. And budgeting by categories can really help. rather than having to say how many beneficiaries in what locations. And sometimes you have no idea of knowing. So, just doing that as percentages. And you can actually tell here, because of the numbers involved, that this at the top here is 10% of that, of the total. So that's how I put that budget together. And budgeting in categories can be quite nice. Now, the grant was successful, and this was the budget for the next few years, and it was really nice and flexible. It was great. So I quite like that approach. Okay, another naughty tip: be very, very careful. But every now and again, it might be necessary to make stuff up. I can't really think of a good example. I can't really think of an occasion when I've done this. So I would potentially tell you that this is very naughty, and you might do this in 1% of your work, but you might need to make something up. And it might be something that is about to happen, or it might be something, because it hasn't happened yet, but by the time they're reading this, it will have happened. It might be a paper reference that doesn't exist yet, but immediately once you've submitted it, there's the reference, because you can put it on your website. So occasionally, you might need to make something up, but be very careful. Don't make up facts, and be very careful if you're using AI, because that can make up facts willy-nilly because it just sounds good. They don't look things up, they just look at the language. Yeah, I can't really think of a good example, but every now and again, a naughty trick is to make something up because it fits with the narrative. Very naughty. Another trick, and sometimes this is good, and sometimes, so sometimes this isn't naughty, sometimes this is okay. Put the process into the project. If you don't know at the start of your project who you're going to work with, who your partners are going to be, don't let that be a problem. Say, we're going to build it into the project. We're going to partner with local manufacturers near my makerspace who can scale up production. And part of the project will be resource to go out and meet them and hold dialogues and, and engage with people. Turn it into part of the project. So if you haven't got time to do the research needed to design the project before you apply, or quite frankly, and time is money, if you haven't got the resource to do that, put it into the project. And I've done that with this project, with RISA. I've literally said with this project, we're going to prototype something and then scale it up. The prototyping will help us figure out how to scale it up. We'll do it with one makerspace first, such as onboarding DTI to the SeekMake platform. Once we know if it works and how that works, we'll do it with the other makerspaces. Put the process into the project. That can help. I'm not sure I've got time to tell you about the Australia Humanitarian Partnership story, but in full. But the innovative manufacturing in Africa story, I've hinted at that. But let me just say, with the Australia Humanitarian Partnership, this was a major fund for humanitarian relief in the Pacific region for countries like Fiji and Vanuatu that are often affected by disasters. And what happened was that we wanted to make supplies locally on demand in the field. And the Australian government was scratching its head going, but what are we buying here? We're used to buying buckets and blankets and food. And normally we hear how many people in how many countries get how many buckets, or how many people in how many places get how many kilograms of food. What we were selling was not what they were buying. What we were selling was capability. We were selling makerspace. We built mobile makerspaces, and we built a makerspace in Fiji. We didn't know what was going to be needed in a crisis in advance, but we're going to put the capability in place to make that happen. And essentially, the Australian government hated this. They were like, literally, they wrote back to me and said, well, it's a 5-year project, so why don't you take the first 3 years to work out what you're going to make? Then you can make it in the 4th year, and then you can report on it in the 5th year. They obviously didn't understand makerspaces. 5 years, and you only make something in the 4th year? No, I was like, no. We are going to work out what we need to make on the Monday morning, and it'll be made by the Monday afternoon. And that's how we meet a need. They didn't understand it. So the process of figuring out what we were going to make should be part of the project. Now, in the end, someone said, if this works, it'll be very good PR, because you'll have 3D printers in disaster relief. It'll be very good media coverage. So the Australian government actually approved it in the end, because someone applied pressure to them. Someone in the donor management company said, if this works, yeah, sure, you're not sure what you're going to get, but if it works, it's going to be great PR. And because of that recommendation, they funded the project, and we got away with it. But literally, they didn't want us to get the grant until someone said this will be good PR. So sometimes in that case, it's important to keep in touch with the fund managers so that they understand you a bit and can advocate on your behalf.